This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. Are you annoyed with your government? Do you think you could do a better job at running the state? Maybe even just have some parking fines that you really want overturned at the moment? Well then, you might be considering starting a rebel movement or your very own breakaway state. However, as appealing as this might sound to some online teenagers, the reality is far more difficult, bloody, and much more limited than one would probably think. Now, put aside that once in power, there are going to be thousands of problems to solve. And just for now, let's just focus on the very first thing you're probably going to need to do in order to start your breakaway state. That being getting your hands on a whole bunch of guns. Now, before I go any further forward, and under the advice of our legal help, I want to stress that this is all 100% hypothetical. We are not advocating for any violence or advocating for the overthrow of any particular state. All of this is simply just an educational exercise to demonstrate where the roadblocks lie for a potential rebel insurgency. Okay, so with that aside, let's get back to our hypothetical rebel group. Now, for us to take over a state, we're going to need a lot of guns, probably a lot of ammunition, and it also wouldn't hurt to have some heavier weapons like mortars or a whole bunch of Toyota Hiluxes. But where would I actually go to get my hands on this stuff? Can I just go down to the dodgy part of my city and order crates of weapons? Can I call up Russia and ask them to supply me with a tank brigade's worth of stuff in exchange for me giving Putin a shout out during my inauguration speech? Or can I simply place an order for an army's worth of weapons with a private defense contractor? After all, it's a private company. What stops me calling up a company like Kalashnikov and simply ordering everything they've got sitting in the factory? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to be answering here today. What is the state of the small arms trade today? Which countries are the new hotspots for buying up these sort of weapons? And what kind of deals am I going to have to make in order to get my hands on the amount of weapons my group is probably going to need? But to start, let's take a look at how the white, grey, and black markets work and how these weapons actually end up in the hands of black market sellers in the first place. And to take us through the process, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. An army without arms.
If we're talking about illicit arms, in economic terms, the market is really weird. If we think about the sort of global arms market in total, the vast majority of it is wholly legal. You've got weapons being made lawfully in factories, highly regulated. You've got international trade, which again is highly regulated. And then you have variations in the degree of illegality.
Nicholas Marsh is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, who specializes in arms trafficking, arms acquisition, and the role of international organizations within the arms industry. On top of that, he's also a former consultant for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the former chair of the European Research Network, and a former research fellow with the UK Defence Forum. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
We tend to divide the rest of the trade that isn't wholly legal into sort of several categories. The semi-legal trade takes place when you have a mixture of legal and illegal activities going on. With other aspects of the trade, what we're looking at is weapons being diverted from legal authority into illicit hands, illicit markets, or for illicit purposes. So, for example, you might get an assault rifle that was lawfully made in a factory, and then it could be corruptly sold by somebody in charge of an arsenal, sold to a criminal organization, and at that point it's diverted into the illicit markets.
So let's start this fairly simple and pose a bit of a hypothetical. Let's say I want to go purchase a whole lot of guns to go arm my rebel group. Can I go call a company like Kalashnikov in Russia or Colt in the US and just place an order with them for an army's worth of rifles?
People very rarely, for example, buy eggs or potatoes directly from a farmer. They go to a shop and buy them. The same applies to sales to civilians of firearms. You'll go to a retail store of some kind to buy them, and very rarely would you buy them directly from the manufacturer. If you're a rebel group trying to get hold of weapons, very rarely would you be able to go to a company operating lawfully and just buy weapons from them. The company would make very little profit of selling them to you. Most rebel groups have very few combatants. They're not a big market. And the downside for the company is enormous for very little money. So what would happen is you would try to get the arms via a much more complicated route.
So if that's the case, where would be the first place I would go in order to try and arm my group?
Major transactions in illicit markets, there is often a state operating somewhere in there. So you might be able to, say, go to a third party, another country, a Ministry of Defense, which is much more open to corruption, and buy the weapons from that Ministry of Defense, say a corrupt official. You might be able to capture them, to steal them from a government. You might be able to get arms from via an illicit broker or dealer, who again might be able to get hold of weapons via forged documentation.
So I'm going to need to find a country or territory that has lots of guns and a government or army willing to accept my briefcase of money in exchange for some of those guns. And already I'm sure people listening have a few candidates running through their mind that probably tick those boxes. However, the reality of the market these days is often very different to what most people expect. As whilst back in the early 90s, yes, Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania and Uzbekistan were always solid places to go look for Soviet caliber weapons and ammo. So why is it then that before 2022, you're probably going to have a much better chance of acquiring what you're looking for in countries like Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, Syria, Sudan, and Egypt, countries that don't traditionally have massive arms export industries? So why is it we've seen this change in the market on where these illicit guns are much more easy to purchase these days?
Especially in areas such as Sahel, in Africa, other parts of the Middle East, we've had conflicts going on and off for decades. And you see weapons circulating and recirculating around. I mean, obviously, a firearm needs to be maintained, otherwise it will cease to be useful. But if it's maintained to a certain degree, then it'll last for decades. And what we saw historically, there was two sort of big phases of arms proliferation. Firstly, during the Cold War, you had the Warsaw Pact, the NATO allies. You had large numbers of wars going on around the world, and then each side of the Cold War would be supplying massive quantities of weapons to their allies, friends, partners, and the other side would be getting supplies from the other superpower and their allies. So Cold War, there was massive proliferation of weapons, particularly in Africa and Asia. You then saw in the 1990s sort of collapse of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, etc. And for a period, it became pretty easy to get hold of stocks of weapons that were built up during the Cold War and were being sold off very cheaply. Most of those countries in Europe, the former Soviet states, they've got their acts together. So it's no longer possible to turn up at a military base in Central Europe with a load of cash and just leave with a container loads of weapons.
Now, the period where it was incredibly easy to just go up to a Russian base and ask the commander for some crates of weapons was right at the end of the Soviet Union. And the end of conflicts do tend to breed these kind of problems. And I'll explain what I mean here. So at the end of the Cold War, Europe had a huge stockpile of weapons just sitting around, a bit of a side effect of everyone anticipating World War III breaking out at any moment. And when the Cold War ended and things were a bit chaotic, a good chunk of that stockpile ended up going missing. But the majority of it ended up in national armies' bunkers and warehouses. Then, a few years later, we saw the Yugoslav wars kick off. And immediately both sides start buying and receiving boatloads of weapons very, very quickly. After all, everyone felt like it was do and die at the time. Now, many of those weapons were either coming in far too quickly or were from sources that didn't want to be attributed. And so it was pretty difficult to keep an airtight inventory of either what had or hadn't entered a warehouse. And even as the war goes on, inventory also becomes more difficult because you're using irregular soldiers, who not only use up far more bullets than the average soldier would, but also don't keep as good track of what they're using. And getting towards the end of the war, more and more inaccuracies on what is actually in these stockpiles will continue to pile up, as it's always difficult to know what may have been stolen or may have just been lost in a NATO air raid. And what this does is create a situation where at, let's say, 11:59 PM, you have a war raging where you need every single bullet, every gun, every grenade you can possibly get a hand of. And then, inexplicably, at some point in time, an armistice kicks in. The clock turns to 12, and now you have very little use for this large cache of weapons sitting in the country. And now, I'm not saying this happens with every army, I'm not saying it happens with every officer, and I'm not suggesting that it happens on one side more than the other, but at that point in time, if you're a mid-level officer overseeing this cache of weapons at your outpost, and you know that, well, in a couple of days, logistics units are going to come and pick it all up and put it back into the national stockpiles to sit there for decades, it's not hard to see how certain thoughts might cross that officer's mind. After all, the war's ended, he might not know if he has a job in 2 weeks, his pay is probably all over the shop considering he's in the middle of a war, and very quickly we can see how it's quite easy for a lot of these weapons at the end of a conflict to quickly go missing before they can then be inventoried and properly put into the system or stored in national bunkers by the army. And of course, some of these weapons will immediately go on the market, but others will go into storage and into people's basements and bunkers and slowly seep out onto the black market over the next few years, or even just be kept lying in that warehouse hoping to sell a big cache of these weapons to a foreign government sometime in the future. So can you take us through how this happens and why it's usually easier to get a hold of weapons in areas that have just come out of a conflict?
First and most dramatically is where you get governments collapsing. The most obvious example was Libya in 2011. But you've also got partial collapses such as Mali 2012, Syria, and that's where you get very large state stockpiles of weapons coming into the hands of non-state groups and diffusing throughout society. And then second, the major source of proliferation has been sort of state supplies. For example, we had the civil war in Syria, and you had both from the US and also from Gulf states massive supplies of arms going into the anti-Assad forces, billions of dollars worth per year. And then later, in a legal grey area, huge supplies of arms going to the anti-IS forces.
So what about a force like IS, for instance?
Well, if we're talking about IS, they weren't getting significant supplies from outside Syria and Iraq. They were capturing everything that they were using. You also had a limited amount of production of, particularly things like mortar rounds. That was going on inside Syria or Iraq. So a lot of the times, if you're looking at a non-state group, the most important source for them is capturing it, especially from the government they're fighting against. Ammunition's obviously a big problem, and especially for much larger groups. Again, if we're talking about the anti-Assad forces in Syria, they were needing tons of ammunition per week. And that ammunition was being supplied by the United States, by Gulf states, in very large quantities via Turkey for the most part, and via Jordan. For sort of less intense conflicts, organized crime groups, there's a variety of ways they can get hold of ammunition. For example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, what you're seeing is them being able to buy ammunition quite easily via proxies in the United States, and then it can be trafficked, south over the border into Mexico and further, or taken by air or sea into other Latin American or Caribbean states.
So this then raises a pretty obvious question, but how can you actually track the origin of these guns? I mean, each of these guns should be trackable and identifiable based on the markings and certificates that come with the gun. For an example, let's talk about the classic AK-47. Now, we can usually pick that gun up, and we can check the serial number found on the left side of the receiver, as each of these weapons can include logos, letters, or symbols specific to the factory that firearm was produced in. Otherwise, even from a distance at first glance, there are a lot of variations in these guns that help identify where that gun was made. If we stick for an AK-47, for example, the Chinese version of the 47, the Type 56, often comes with a hooded front and sometimes a folding spike bayonet, whereas the Romanian version of the AK usually comes with a slightly more curved magazine. A Yugoslav-made AK might tend to have a thicker receiver, and many of them also come with a grenade launching sight on them as well. And if our AK has Arabic on it, there's a pretty good chance it was probably made in an Egyptian plant sometime in the last 40 years. And if you talk to particular experts, they can identify guns pretty easily. So if we can tell so much about these weapons when we capture them in the hands of insurgents or from an arms dealer, why is it then for criminal prosecution that it's always difficult to pin this back to the manufacturer and charge them with the guns that end up in other people's hands?
It is possible sometimes to trace the route that weapons have taken. It's not just the serial numbers. I mean, those are important, obviously, on the weapons, but also if people are able to get hold of any documentation used in the shipping, that can be a lot more important. You also may get markings on the weapon when it's been imported. So you could tell, for example, it was originally manufactured in one country and then imported by another. So that's quite an involved activity. It takes quite a lot of technical knowledge. So if there's a container load or a crate load of Kalashnikovs found, the documents on the side of the crate might be more important than the actual serial numbers. And it's definitely possible for governments, for example, police forces, to send tracing requests to the manufacturer. Firstly, that the government or company that receives the tracing request may not provide any useful information. Second problem is they may say, okay, the arms were made in this factory in this year, they are exported to this other country, and then the trail may go cold. A diversion point, for example, if the guns were then corruptly sold by an official, there's no record of that happening. The guns just disappear. So it is possible to trace them sometimes, but it's not a wholly reliable activity.
Now, we have somewhat decent numbers on the amount of guns that are made legally, but how many do you think are currently sitting out there on the black market?
It really depends on the country and the level of state effectiveness, legal controls, how effective are the police forces, etc. Certainly in some places, for example, Iraq in 2003, after the invasion, you saw a pretty much complete collapse of state authority. There were lots of reports from journalists of sort of open air arms. So there can be very high levels of proliferation after a war, but it really depends on the outcome. It's very difficult to say how much there is, but clearly a lot. If we're looking at organized crime, if we're looking at wars, non-state groups fighting in wars, they have enough weapons to be able to carry on for quite a long time. As you said earlier, ammunition is something which it would be easier to cut off the supply of ammunition. If we were to stop all arms production tomorrow, there's still very large quantities in the world. Those arms are already in existence, will probably carry on circulating. So it would take a long time, a complete stop in production to actually have a noticeable effect.
So for my theoretical rebel group, what are the limitations of what I can and can't buy in this market? I think it's great that we can get a hold of Kalashnikovs and some PKMs, maybe even some light mortars. But what if I wanted to go buy, let's say, a jet fighter for my army? That's something we don't see very often in these rebel groups. So could you take us through why we don't see rebel groups pursuing weapons like that and why there are so few sold on the black market?
That's a very good question. There's several explanations. Firstly, the demand for an illicit jet fighter is very small. Just to operate it, you're going to need a whole maintenance crew. You're going to need a trained pilot. If anybody did start operating illicit jet fighters, this would get a lot of attention from the rest of the world. So even though it might seem quite cool or attractive, very, very few non-state groups actually have the capacity to use one or would want to. Also, the more sophisticated weapons with much greater firepower have a lot more state control over them. So, for example, there's been for many decades a lot of concern about terrorist rebel groups, organized crime groups even getting hold of anti-aircraft missiles, especially portable ones. But we actually see very few cases of groups that have used those kind of weapons outside of active war zones. Very few cases of functioning portable missiles and launchers actually being trafficked outside of war zones. And again, that's partly due to demand. Very few non-state groups would actually want to do something like bring down a civilian airliner.
So let's say then that my rebel group has graduated from a small ragtag bunch of guys in the hills, and we're now a semi-recognized breakaway state, similar to Transnistria or South Ossetia or even Somaliland, meaning we have some sort of quasi-sovereignty. Now, if I have some sort of sovereignty like this, can I then call up someone like General Dynamics and order a whole bunch of Abrams tanks for my new breakaway state?
That's an interesting prospect. Basically, if Transnistria wanted to buy Abrams tanks, the US company trying to sell them would have to get an export license from the US government. And it would be very unlikely to get that export license. So Transnistria would they'd be making a lot of calls and they'd be politely declined or nobody would bother to call them back. Dnistra or other states like Somaliland, they probably can get hold of weapons, but the best way for them would be to have a friendly government that was willing to overlook the export control laws. So that would be the usual way of getting hold of them.
Okay, so we haven't had any luck reaching out to these US companies, but let's say in the hypothetical, I bump into the US president down at the pub, and he seems pretty chuffed about my foreign policy stances, and so decides that he wants to back my hypothetical group. What would be the most likely way that a state would go about achieving that? What rules would stand in their way? And if a nation state was willing to back my republic with arms, what would be the most likely way about doing that?
It depends on how secretive we want this to be. If I don't really care about other people knowing what we're doing, then that's quite simple. I can go to friendly governments, ask them to sell some of their stocks, or companies in those states, ask them, can you produce 10,000 rifles fairly quickly? I wouldn't be trying to buy stocks from NATO members, for example. I might be looking to buy stocks from countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America. If their Ministry of Defense has an extra 10,000 rifles, for example, they're willing to sell, then I would also be looking at trying to find a clandestine way of shipping them. If we're doing this without wanting to attract attention, then the shipping would be done via private companies who would be willing to take that work on. And there are not many air freight companies who would be willing to be involved in illicit arms transactions, but they do exist. So the transport would be more difficult.
Now, obviously, the usual suspects in Europe are pretty much cleaned out of all their spare arms and supplies, as every skerrick of spare Russian caliber small arms that was sitting in Europe has pretty much been snapped up by NATO and sent into the war in Ukraine. So right now, from my understanding, there's a bit of a shortage on the market for Russian caliber arms. But if the usual suspects like Albania and Ukraine don't have much lying around at the moment, where would be my next port of call to go looking for Russian caliber weapons?
We've seen with Ukraine, particularly with ammunition, the US, European countries have been scouring the world looking for surplus stocks to send into Ukraine. At some point, it's going to get more difficult. If we're looking at places remaining with huge stockpiles of weapons, you would want to look at places with very large armed forces. China, for example, North Korea, India would be places that have very large armed forces, and it would be possible for them to perhaps give up some of their stocks. Whether they'd want to do that or not is another question.
Now, most of the guns we've been talking about here in this chapter went into production to supply countries in the Cold War or the Yugoslav wars or even the war on terror, and are still having a pretty big impact on the market today. So are there any concerns floating around that regardless of what happens at the end of the war in Ukraine, that win, lose or draw, there is a risk of a brand new wave of weapons entering the market and disappearing as the fighting stops?
In general, what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is an increase in the level of armed conflict around the world. That's both in terms of the number of conflicts and the number of people killed, the intensity. So obviously this is a big concern. A lot of these conflicts, not least Ukraine, involve large quantities of arms being supplied from outside. The concern is kind of twofold. Firstly, one outcome of wars is sometimes a complete state collapse. The rebels take hold of the capital city, but they aren't able to effectively take control of the whole country. Or there's a military coup, the civilian government collapses, the military is unable to keep control of the country. And in those occasions, you get very high levels of proliferation when all of the state stocks are very quickly appropriated. So that's a concern. Secondly, as you said, after a peace agreement, there can be problems. We saw that in former Yugoslavia, where decades afterwards, we've still got a problem with weapons that were stored in attics, leaking out, coming into Europe. With Ukraine, it's very difficult to know or predict what will happen. At the moment, the Ukrainian government has got pretty good control of the weapons inside Ukraine. Likewise, we're not seeing large amounts of trafficking coming out of the areas occupied by Russia. High-intensity wars like that tend to suck in weapons rather than we see trafficking coming out of them. But certainly a scenario in which there was some kind of collapse of state authority would be the most concerning in terms of proliferation.
So it seems for my rebel group, there's going to be some difficulties getting a hold of the weapons from a country that hasn't either decided to already back me, like the Russians do for Abkhazia, or through only buying tiny amounts of odds and ends of weapons in the market, which is hardly a good solution if I seek to be a grand and powerful empire, which means we're probably going to need to look elsewhere. And if we look back at the qualifications we went through earlier on, such as weak governance, recently fought a war on its soil, and has a state desperately in need of cash, then there's definitely two names that come to mind, that being Afghanistan and Pakistan. But if I were to travel to these countries and try to use these guys to get the supplies I need, would they actually be able to supply my military? What do the Afghans have to sell? Where do they get a hold of all these weapons? And how reliable would the Afghans be as a long-term arms supplier? Well, to answer all that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Second-hand slaughter.
It's not as easy as usually displayed. The easiest way to explain it is probably that the Taliban as an insurgency had various sources for small arms. One big one was, and to some extent still is, that Afghanistan has been flooded with small arms and other weapons during the Afghan war against the Soviet Union in the 80s. And there's still a lot of this stuff around. Sometimes even nowadays, there are quite credible reports that some of these weapons provided by the West, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan to fight the Soviet Union that have never been taken out of the original crate. Another thing was then obviously that the Taliban, the stronger they got, when they overran Afghan army positions, they captured a lot that the West was providing to the Afghan Republic. So this also made a large part.
Franz J. Marty is a fellow at the Swiss Institute for Global Affairs, specializing in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Caucasus. Franz was also based on the ground in Afghanistan for 10 years, reporting from the country right from the Taliban surge through the fall of Kabul up until only just a few months ago. His work in Afghanistan included exclusive interviews with the Taliban and members of the self-declared Islamic State of Khorasan, as well as embeds and unaccompanied investigative reporting from the various and remote corners of Afghanistan. He's been published in pretty much every publication you could think of, and we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
Most of the time, Afghan government officials would always claim the Taliban get sophisticated weapons from some source. Usually the finger was pointed at Pakistan or sometimes also Iran, which very often, if you followed up on what these sophisticated modern weapons are, you would get answers from Afghan government officials like RPG-7, which is quite old and can be sourced from various different sources. So that there is a lot of wrong information out there.
So I think a good place to start then is, how many guns do you think are roughly sitting in Afghanistan at the moment?
Maybe I can answer this with an anecdote. Some years ago, still under the Republic, there was in a remote area in Afghanistan, there was an armed local group that had problems with the Taliban and had problems with the government. And I tried to figure out how many armed men they have, how many guns they have, how much of a resistance they actually could put up if they would try to. I asked this commander in question. He was evasive about it. My best guess is because he didn't really know. And eventually, a little bit more pushed, he replied, "We have 30,000 houses here in our area. There's not one house without a gun." So 30,000 guns. And that's probably somewhat true. In many areas of Afghanistan, that there are so many guns around that no one really knows how many. And that sometimes it's just everybody has a rifle from someone and keeping it because no one knows what will happen in Afghanistan and maybe you need it at some point to protect you and your family. So there are tons of weapons around and I can't see them running out anytime soon.
So we'll come back to the civilian market in a bit, but for now, let's take a look at the Taliban-led Afghan state, as they have one of the oddest arms inventories I've ever seen a state have. On the one hand, they have a whole bunch of the old classics you'd expect, Kalashnikovs, PMKs, RPGs, etc., etc. But they also have a whole bunch of NATO standard equipment as well, a small percentage of which captured during the evacuation from Afghanistan, but the majority of these having been captured from A&A stockpiles. Even going back as far as the mid-2010s, the Taliban were already capturing more and more Afghan National Army stockpiles, to the point where the Taliban were well supplied throughout the back half of the campaign. But because of this odds and ends and collection of weapons through conquest rather than procurement programs, you end up with this odd arms system, where even now, if you go to Kabul, you can see Taliban authorities patrolling the streets in US-made Humvees, with some even holding US-made rifles, whilst the police unit down the street is walking around with Chinese-made rifles, and the border patrol just up the road is using all Russian rifles. Now the NATO stuff, the stuff that usually appears in the Taliban propaganda videos, is usually a bit nicer than the other stuff. But I also don't see the US being keen to offer the Afghans modernization kits for those US Humvees anytime soon, which then raises questions about their operational longevity. Now, obviously running a military with completely different weapon suppliers can be an absolute pain for planning, logistics, and procurement. So at some point when the Taliban runs out of ammunition or replacement parts for these weapons, they're going to need to actually start buying some from the market, as there aren't any stockpiles left to conquer in the country. And now that they've tried Chinese-made weapons and Russian-made weapons and US-made weapons, do you see which way they'll look to go in the future? Do you think they'll try and go back to the US and buy the replacement parts for the more advanced kit they have? Or once they burn through these US stockpiles, do you see them trying to pivot back to Russian-style kit?
At the same point in time, some Taliban unit might have used more NATO standard weapons, while the other unit was still more on Soviet weapons because they had easier access or prices. And if there were financial constraints, they would prefer the cheaper one. But one can't generalize this. Even now, the Taliban make a lot of propaganda videos and are very keen on showing that they have professional security forces that all looks like a modern army. If you go out in the field in Afghanistan with border guards at the Tajik border, it looks completely different. They use what they can get their hands on. They had weapon shortages and no standardized weapon. So it's not that every soldier in the unit has the same issued weapon. They have what they have, which can be all the same, which can also be completely mixed up because that's the only access they had.
Now, we know many of the weapons currently floating around Afghanistan were manufactured across a whole series of locations. Some of them from the war against the Soviets will have been made in either USSR factories or might also be Egyptian licensed copies that the US purchased to supply to the Mujahideen in the 1980s. Some of these weapons may have also been cheaply made in Pakistan to supply the Taliban against the US. But with all these different types of rifles flowing into the country, are they all pretty much the same to the Afghans or any rebel group? Or are there preferences on what versions of these weapons they like to use?
Among Afghans, there is an understanding that there are different types of Kalashnikovs and they have different reputations. The original Russian ones are the most sought after or seen as the best ones. The Chinese are also seen as good ones. And then like Egyptians, it also reflects in prices. For example, the weapons that are made in Pakistan, they're sold very cheaply, but that you can also quite easily identify. To some extent, the Afghans understand this. To some extent, they refer inaccurately to different models. So sometimes their understanding of what comes from where or which type comes from where is not necessarily what reality actually is. Despite having carried rifles for all their life, barely understand how the thing works.
So when the war against the Americans came to a close and the Taliban inherited the last of these weapons, how many were they able to actually seal away in government storage? And how much effort did they put into getting these weapons back from the militias stationed across the country? In other words, how much control does the central authority have over these weapon stockpiles today?
The Taliban try to control weapons that they have seized. I have seen this myself in the month right after the fall. They're still doing that. That said, they're not necessarily doing that out of the good of their hearts or because they want to show to the international community that they are a responsible government. They do this mainly for self-preservation because they are very much afraid that if guns are around, they are not under their control, that they might at some point be used against the Taliban. So they have done several efforts to secure weapon depots of the disintegrated army and also to gather and seize weapons that are in private hands or anywhere else inside Afghanistan.
Obviously, the Taliban being in control of this amount of weapons and also being quite short on cash at the moment, there's always this big fear going around that the Afghans would end up being a giant arms dealing hub for actors looking to pick up black market US weapons. If I am a rebel group seeking to buy US arms, is Afghanistan going to be a good market for me? Or has all the speculation online been mostly just rumors?
To some extent, they're true. Of course, things get sold, but it's not as extreme as often portrayed. For example, there's little on tracking serial numbers, which to some extent would be possible if you find weapons wherever. to record the serial number and see where it came from. Even if you would do that, it could mean that the Taliban sold them directly to where you found it, but it could also mean that it goes through several hands. For example, I was told recently by a source very close to the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban, that TTP members inside Afghanistan buy weapons from former soldiers, Afghan soldiers, that are affiliated with the National Resistance Front because they sell them cheaper than the Taliban. So then you might have an Afghan army weapon supplied by the US ending up in the hands of Pakistani Taliban, who uses it somewhere in Pakistan, but it actually didn't come from the Afghan Taliban. It came from former soldier affiliated with anti-Taliban resistance, because weapons dealing, at some point, politics don't play a role anymore.
Okay, so there's a whole lot of guns still functioning in the country, but what about ammunition? Surely after decades of fighting, a lot of that ammunition has now been expended. And if I'm looking to Afghanistan as a source of ammunition, A, do they actually have the deep stockpiles I probably need? And B, am I better off approaching Afghanistan for US caliber ammunition, or am I better off just sticking with Russian caliber ammunition?
At some points in time and some places, sometimes it was easier to get NATO standard munition, for example, because a lot was captured from the Afghan army. Otherwise, it was easier to get the Soviet ammunition. A well-placed Taliban source said recently that the Taliban are worried about where they now can source weapons and ammunition. So they are aware of the problem that there might at some point be a shortcoming. At one point, the Taliban might be again more interested in Soviet-made weapons rather than the NATO standard weapons that they captured from the Afghan army, because in tendency, ammunition is easier to buy for the Soviet standard weapons. To what extent there are shortages now or how long this will last, I'm not aware of reliable information to that end.
The fact that there isn't a solid policy and there's this massive disconnection in the current arms supply process, do you think that's a specific choice being made by the administration in Kabul? Or is this really just Kabul making do with what they have, considering the budgetary problems they're facing at the moment?
The border guards at the Tajik border, they complained to me that they get little support from the chain of command, that they said they have not enough weapons. It was as bad that it was like for dozens of men, only 10 guns. They literally don't have one rifle per soldier. Soldiers have to share rifles. And they claimed that they got little support for that. In other areas, that might be different. But for me, this is just an indication there's no policy. My guess is that the Taliban, the policy would be to standardize everything, but no plan survives first enemy contact. So it gets lost somewhere on the way. And if you go to really remote areas, it ends up haphazard.
So let's say I've arrived in Afghanistan and I'm looking to buy a lot of guns for my rebel group. How much do you think would be openly available to someone without deep connections into the military or government? Are we looking at massive open markets selling crates of weapons? Or are we looking at something like smaller bazaars where these weapons are mostly sold piecemeal in a similar fashion to chairs, rugs, or car parts?
The norm is that you have, in certain areas, smaller or bigger markets where guns are openly sold. Inside Afghanistan, I know a place in Hogiani, in Nangarhar, where this has happened since forever. A bigger one regionally is in the Tira Valley, just across the border in Khyber, in Pakistan, where there is a larger place. And there you have people who deal in larger quantities. But to my knowledge, the vast majority of it is done by local sellers who sell often small quantities, not on an industrial scale.
Okay, so if US caliber kit, and to a lesser extent Russian caliber kit, is in pretty short supply for the central authorities, then my group may have to go look at Pakistani-made weapons for supply, with these Pakistani weapons often not being made in a factory, but instead through artisanal processes. In other words, small workshops and in backyards. This process being particularly common when it comes to ammunition manufacturing. But how reliable are these weapons that are made through artisanal processes in Pakistan? And how do the Afghans view using these weapons?
These Pakistani artisanal factories, they can do quite a lot, but there are differences in what can be done. I have seen Pakistani made pistols that are sold very cheap. They're usually only bought by people who can't afford anything better. And I also understand why. The pistol, it's literally, you have to be afraid that it's like Looney Tunes, that the gun will blow up in your hand and you're standing there with a black face, so to speak. Such concerns are certainly also affecting ammunition. If it doesn't come from a proper factory, from a proper state-owned vetted factory, you don't really know what you're buying, and you turn to that if you don't have anything else, or if you don't know better.
So I'm sure you see these bold stories all the time about the Afghans having this state-of-the-art NATO tech that they use and are occasionally selling off to the Pakistani groups. But from the internal reports, it really seems that the US took most of the really good kit with them, only leaving behind what they deemed as simply not really worth taking home or too big to take home, e.g. things like the Humvees, that would in reality probably have been mothballed by now had they made it back to the States. So with that in mind, if the Afghan government is having troubles effectively acquiring the weapons they need, and if the rest of the market is so decentralized and full of questionable Pakistani copies that it would be probably more pain than it's worth to use them as arms suppliers, how viable is Afghanistan as a long-term weapon supplier? And what do you think the reality is surrounding how sophisticated their weapons are and what weapons they actually have access to at the moment?
People readily believe that there have been like vast weapon supply of modern, sophisticated equipment, guns by other states directly to the Taliban. I'm not saying that nothing of this ever happened, but usually most of these reports are vague hearsay. And if something like this happened, it happened much more indirectly and in a different way that most people imagine. It's not that some unmarked helicopter drops dozens of huge crates in a moonless night. It works differently. One recent example where you can see these kinds of misunderstandings is the fact that Pakistani Taliban have begun to use thermal vision scopes on their rifles is often cited directly as a sign that the Taliban captured modern military-grade sophisticated night vision equipment from the Afghan army that was provided by the Americans and are now selling it to the TTP or providing it to the TTP, who use it and have an edge over the Pakistani army. I have done research into these scopes when the Taliban themselves inside Afghanistan used them. Those are hunting scopes, hunting rifle scopes. Practically without exceptions, all these night vision scopes are commercially available, most likely bought in a shop in Dubai and then smuggled to Afghanistan. So it's not some conspiracy about military-grade night vision that is going on. It is actually just some guy going in a shop, buying something where he can do it legally. Probably he lies about his documentation and so on, but the sale itself is not illegal. And then it passes through various hands and diverse channels and ends up in a bad place. In a place in Afghanistan, a lot of it is just improvised, because the insurgent or now the government, they always have to deal with uncertainties. So given that they don't know what tomorrow will be, it's just an improvised session and not some streamlined business concept or a streamlined bazaar.
Okay, so our rebel group is going to have to keep looking, as the Afghans do have some weapons, but they only really got them in the first place effectively through the backing of larger states, whether it be the Soviets backing the communist-aligned regime, or the US backing the Mujahideen, or the US backing the Afghan National Army. And the country these days has little to no indigenous production capacity, so I don't think they're going to be able to provide me the arms my group is probably going to need, particularly for any major operations. So it looks like we're going to have to head back to the grey market and see if we can either elicit support from a nation state or find a way for a legal company to supply me with the arms I need. And to find out how effective those frameworks are and what's currently in place to prevent rebel groups from getting access to these kinds of weapons, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. Discounted Death.
I think it's kind of helpful to take a slight step back and kind of acknowledge that there is a certain level of ambiguity about how you draw a distinction between the white, grey and black markets. The arms trade occupies quite a unique position in terms of global trade. So on the one hand, there is a very clear obligation that states have to regulate the trade in arms, and a certain level of clarity about which arms transfers are viewed from an international perspective to be illegal.
Mark Bromley is a senior researcher with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, working with the Dual Use and Arms Trade Control Program, with Mark's work specializing in the national, regional and international efforts to regulate the trade in conventional arms and dual-use items. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
But then on the other hand, there is also a lot of leeway in terms of how states implement those controls. So under both WTO and EU rules, the implementation of controls on the arms trade is considered to be a foreign and security policy issue and left under the prerogative of states. And it's also worth noting that there's no explicit prohibition on supplying unauthorized non-state actors in the international rules. So what that leaves us with is when both the exporting and the importing state have given all the necessary approvals and it's fully above board, and quite a clear sense of what constitutes the black market would be where neither state has given the necessary approvals. A classic example there would be the guns that are being smuggled across the border from the United States to Mexico.
So you mentioned Mexico and the US there, and I think for a moment it's a bit of an interesting rabbit hole to go down. You see, the arms trade in the Americas, particularly north of the Darien Gap, is actually very different to something like an ISIS or a Libya. In fact, in Latin America, whilst drugs usually travel north, it's the guns that usually travel south. Part of the reason for which is because cartels' demands are actually really different to what a group like ISIS or a rebel force in Libya would require for their needs. Because cartels aren't doing things like creeping mortar barrages or using brigades of men all advancing at once to take a town. The demands for what a cartel needs are actually much more spread out. Whereas an army might be able to stockpile munitions for 3 months to carry out 2 days of rapid offensive into a town, the cartel will just burn through a small amount of ammunition every day, whether it be for gang operations or simply just to maintain order where they are. It's a slow burn every day versus massive demands as offensives kick off. And it's why here in Latin America, we see a lot more of a process called ant trafficking, where usually Mexican or US citizens will legally enter the United States and then buy a handful of guns, shotguns, or rifles, either from a private seller or any of the over 8,500 licensed gun dealers across Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, and California. And then they'll take those guns and bring them back into Mexico, usually just a few units at a time. And whilst the United States is the obvious marketplace for this, it's not the only one. We get into this exact same sort of process happening in South America, on the border between Brazil and French Guiana, where a Brazilian citizen can cross into French Guiana, buy up high-powered rifles and certain categories of gun that are illegal in Brazil but are purchasable in French Guiana, and then simply hide them or take them apart and smuggle them back into Brazil, to be sold at a much greater value into the Brazilian market. Although French Guiana is just a drop in the pond compared to what we see coming out of the United States. You see, the United States gun laws have been a godsend for the cartels over the years, with the latest estimates suggesting that over 89% of all of the guns in Latin America originally entered the region either as legal purchases from the United States or as black market arms procured during conflicts like the US-backed war in El Salvador or other operations against anti-communist regimes inside Central America. And with the US being such a large market that offers civilian access to these sort of weapons, what it's ended up doing is creating a somewhat uniquely distorted market, where there may be no large arms bazaars like you might find in Libya or Syria, but the barrier to entry for people to get a hold of weapons is also much lower. And it's a fairly accessible task to get those weapons from the United States into Mexico. This creates all sorts of distortions further down the line, which, let's take another second and go through some numbers here. Now, to give you a perspective of why there are so many people involved in this industry, let's take a look at the classic boogeyman of American guns, the AR-15. Now, if I were to go to Texas and purchase that AR-15, it would cost me around $700 for a basic entry-level model. But if I then take that gun and travel across the border into Mexico, that same AR-15 that I bought 3 hours ago is now going to be worth around $1,500 in Mexico, an $800 profit for just driving it across the border. The higher the restrictions on the weapons, the higher the price of the weapons is. And to take it a little further than that, if I were to take that AR-15 and not sell it in Mexico, and instead bring it back to Australia, where the restrictions around gun purchases are very tight, and there's no easy land access to a country that allows the sale of these weapons, finding an AR-15 on the black market is actually much harder to find. When I spoke to a friend who's been covering crime in Mexico for a long time, he suggested that in Tijuana, it wouldn't take him more than an hour to find someone who would sell him an AR-15, whereas in Australia, it is quite difficult to find someone who would even have an AR-15 to sell. And from experience, you'd probably need to have connections with someone within organized crime in order to get one. And if you found that person, that same rifle that you bought for $700 in Texas or $1,500 in Mexico, in Australia, would end up costing you about $25,000 US, which is way out of the price range for any sort of petty criminal or angry teenager. Obviously, talking about gun control is a whole different episode, and it's a much more complex topic to dive into than it is here. But for this episode, all you really need to know is how much the US distorts the Latin American market and the difference between your organization needing a small amount of guns constantly or needing a large amount of guns for one offensive. And now with that in mind, we turn back to our theoretical rebel group, who, as we remember, is still struggling to get their hands on enough weapons. Now, unless I want to establish my group in northern Mexico, or I'm happy to operate off a relatively medium but steady inflow of arms from the civilian market, this concept and this way of supplying my group is pretty much not going to work. So instead, we'll have to try and play closer to the international rules. And rather than trying to be a breakaway rebel group of any certain state, let's instead register myself as a private military company. If I do so, does that mean I can finally approach some of these companies or countries and start purchasing large amounts of the weapons I'm chasing?
Obviously, there is a huge variety in what constitutes a private military company around the world in terms of what types of activities. But for the most part, they are going to be operating under some kind of governmental oversight, or in the case of some of the more controversial ones like the Wagner Group, under the kind of state sponsorship. And that state oversight will encompass some level of control over what types of military equipment, what types of small arms those groups have access to and where they get access to them. So in the case of Wagner Group, it's the Russian state, which is overseeing which weapons it can have and facilitating their provision. But then if you think of groups that are providing security in parts of Latin America or Africa, they're going to be licensed companies, which are then going to be operating under some kind of licensing process for holding privately used firearms.
Meaning that even if I were to get my PMC license, I'm still going to have to work with a legitimate state to do so, which kind of defeats the purpose in the first place. So what if I approach it another way? What if I start my own arms manufacturing company that, let's say, produces US weapons under license? If I'm now a private company and a private enterprise, what then stops me from deciding to sell arms to my friend's rebel group?
If you are a state-owned enterprise, then maybe it's a lot more direct in the sense that the government is right there in terms of directing what sales to pursue and what countries to sell to. When it's more kind of hands-off, more kind of capitalist model, the mechanism is more based around what are called export licenses, where the company has some leeway in determining what markets it wants to pursue, but at the point at which it wants to actually export the arms, it has to apply for a license from the government to do that. And of course, that then would imply that from a commercial perspective, they're not going to pursue deals where they're not going to get a license. So there might be some kind of early warning mechanisms that they'll employ to get a sense of which markets are viable and which aren't. But essentially, things are not being exported without the government's approval.
So if I can't get a license to run a factory to make arms, what about if I become an arms dealer or a reseller? How broad are the licenses I would need to apply for that? Would I need a full and specific license to, let's say, sell an Abrams tank? Or would I need a full license to sell something as small as, let's say, the firing pin of a rifle? Or are these things so restrictive that I couldn't even sell a General Dynamics t-shirt had it been made in the same factory as the Abrams? If I were to pursue becoming a dealer, what would be the license process I go down?
So it's yes for the tank, yes for the firing pin, no for the t-shirt. There is a list of military goods put together by the Wassenaar Arrangement, which are specially designed for a military end use. So that the list of what constitutes is fairly well established internationally. So that gives us this long 100-page document which defines the technical specifics of everything from certain types of software code to certain types of gyroscopes that are considered to be the ones that are integral to the development and use of military systems. Does that create a grey area? Yes. Yeah, there's certainly kind of things at the margins which some state might consider to be covered by that control list and another state might not consider to be covered by it.
However, as much as most of this is all licensed and laid out in these agreements, there is one pretty big workaround in this issue that we are seeing regularly exploited at the moment. That issue being with dual-use technology. So as an example of this, after the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, large amounts of additional sanctions were placed onto Russia, particularly on anything that was viewed to be useful for Moscow's war effort, which all somewhat makes sense. However, it does create a bit of a blurry line. I mean, yes, I think we would all agree that an active targeting system, yeah, that's a no-go, that can't go to Russia. But what about, let's say, a civilian GPS system that, yes, could be used for hiking through the mountains of Siberia, but theoretically could also be used in retrofitting some of Russia's more basic missile systems, filling a gap that they currently have in the production chain? Which then raises the question, should we ban those GPSs, as there's no guarantee that they are being retrofitted to be used in missiles? Now, whilst I'm sure some of you said yes, and whilst I'm sure some of you said no, but in the end it doesn't even matter, as even when restrictions are placed on items like these, third-party countries who aren't under sanctions could simply then just order these parts and then ship them off to Russia if they need them. Which, I'm not pointing fingers here, but it might explain why nations like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Lithuania, and Georgia have all seen their imports in high-tech parts from the EU skyrocketing since 2022, and their exports to Russia in those same products also skyrocketing around the same time, and their exports to Russia in those same products also having a sharp upward spike around the same time, which can only really be solved then by imposing sanctions on that third-party country, which if you're trying to start international alliances or have friends around the world, isn't a great way to go about it. So if my group can't purchase from that country or can't purchase from that company, what stops people using third-party sellers or buying dual-use technology to fill the gaps in their military supply?
Yes, that's a great example. What's happening in Russia over the last couple of years is that there's been an increasing use of what are termed commercial off-the-shelf products in the production of military systems. So particularly when you get down to the level of electronics and these kind of GPS systems and semiconductors, what Russia has clearly been able to do is utilize systems which are built and designed for purely commercial purposes in the production of its weapon systems, which creates an enormous challenge for the export control systems that states have built up over the last 20, 30 years. You can see from some of the enforcement cases that come out of the US every few years that there is a well-functioning network seeking to acquire those items on the black market. There's always been this awareness that export controls are never going to prevent well-motivated states from acquiring military technology or developing military capabilities that they're seeking. If they're really dedicated, if they're really investing heavily in it, it's a significant challenge when you're confronted by a well-motivated and well-connected state apparatus, which Russia clearly has. But it's something that an enormous amount of effort is being expended upon.
So effectively, we're arriving at a point here where if I want to get weapons for my group, I might be better off using third-party dealers, but I'm probably more guaranteed to achieve a better result by pursuing dual-use materials. And fortunately for me, things like consumer drones, 3D printable guns, and cheaper prices for shipping from places in Africa and the Middle East have made this method somewhat more plausible. So do you share the concern that this growing access to dual-use materials and weapons, and the lack of capacity currently available to properly regulate some of these dual-use items, does enable states like Russia, Myanmar, and Syria to be able to evade sanctions and fill parts of their supply chain that they couldn't before? And that now we might live in a world where very small, probably underfunded groups may not be able to easily acquire things like tanks and mortar shells, but can pretty easily get their hands on small adaptable weapons like drones, malicious software, and small individual rifles.
The parts and components going into the Russian defense industry, I think that's just one in a number of cases where it seems apparent technologies and goods that are being produced in the commercial sector for commercial purposes have a very clear capability to have very decisive and destabilizing consequences for the direction of conflict. So there is this broader sense in which the clear delineation between the defense sector and the civilian sector is not as clear cut as it used to be. In addition, cases such as the parts and components that were used to make improvised explosive devices in Iraq and Afghanistan, night vision goggles that the Taliban used in the run-up to 2021, you can see the sense in which goods and technologies which are outside the defense sector, which are certainly not regulated by military export controls, and in a large cases not regulated by dual-use export controls either, are very significant in terms of their ability to provide kind of military advantage to states or non-state actors. And I think how states and then also the commercial sector responds to that and thinks about how to manage risk in such an environment is something which I think all actors are going to have to be thinking about very, very significantly in the years to come.
So after this entire investigation, there's one thing that becomes pretty clear pretty quickly. If you're a rebel group seeking to conquer or take over a country, you really only have three options available to you. The first being a military coup, taking over the governorship of a country quickly so you can usurp the legitimate status of the state in order to legitimately purchase the weapons and ammunition that you're probably going to need to keep your regime in power, particularly if you want to buy better equipment and also buy at scale. None of this is going to work as a rebel group, and instead you have to quickly take over the state, which again is a lot easier said than done, and also often requires having the guns you need behind you in the first place. The second option would be for your group to seek the backing of another state, in the same way that the Transnistrians get their weapons because they have the backing of the Russians. The Mujahideen in the 1980s got their weapons because they had the backing of the United States. The Sudanese RSF gets a lot of their weapons because they have the backing of the UAE. The Houthis in Iran get a lot of their weapons because they have the backing of Iran. And as we can see from states right across the world, if you want any real hope of sustaining a prolonged military campaign against your oppressive government, or building anything close to what most of us would call a sovereign state, you're probably going to need the backing of a state actor. Someone who can legitimately buy weapons on the legal market from the main weapons manufacturers, and then either donate or sell those weapons third party to you, keeping your militia supplied. Although, then again, if your state backer isn't the actual manufacturer of those weapons, the third-party state that you buy those weapons from could also be at risk of having their weapons cut off, which therefore cuts off your weapons. And if your parent state has to choose between the survival of their state or your rebel group, well, that's something not likely to come down favorably for you. And looking at the options left, none of them are really scalable or even sustainable for any type of long-term campaign. For example, if we look at a rebel group like FARC in Colombia, yes, they do have the advantage that there was already a buttload of US weapons lying around the region from the Cold War. But that's a stockpile, which means at some point it will run out, and it's going to be pretty difficult to replace those stockpiles. Which means if your theoretical rebel group was ever hoping to leave the jungles, the only way they can do so is by burning through that stockpile very quickly by going on the offensive. Now, you could try and supply ourselves by completely relying on the black market, buying up anything still laying about the former Yugoslav states, Syria or Afghanistan. But the trouble with the black market is you can never really be sure of how many weapons are going to be on the market at any certain time. Because unlike the white market, where you can call up Kalashnikov and place an order for 20,000 rifles arriving in January, on the black market, you are completely beholden to how many weapons are currently floating around, or how many people are willing to sell the crate of guns they may have stored in their attic. Also, if you do choose to go down this road, it does have a nasty little bonus as well, that the market is unregulated, meaning that, yep, your first 1 or 2 crates might be premium grade Russian ammunition, but the next 50 might be Pakistani ammunition. And if that happens, there's not really much you can do about it. So relying on the black market isn't really a sustainable option. But what if we go down the road of the cartels, effectively just buying weapons on the civilian market and then putting those weapons in the hands of your soldiers? The trouble with this option is that there are major ceilings attached to it. It really makes it much more difficult if you were ever hoping to scale up to a point where you could actually take on a national army. As, again, a cartel-style militia has very different gun and ammunition needs to what you as a breakaway state are probably going to need. And if none of these options are really working for you, now you realize we're arriving in the realm of terrorist groups, taking ourselves out of the league of states like Transnistria or Somaliland, and instead putting ourselves in with groups like the TPP, the Ambazonians, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, or even ISIS-K. who at this point in time have very limited pockets of territory and very little chance of ever being able to develop an economy beyond operations running roadblocks and checkpoints, or selling contraband, or carrying out industrial kidnappings. What we find is that without going down the road of pursuing legitimacy, usually through the recognition by a larger state, or at very minimum larger industries, our group is pretty much doomed to obscurity. So for now, since I'm not willing to carry out the policy of another state, I guess I'm retiring from the rebellion business. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week, back on our usual release day of Mondays. As Mondays seem to be the day that most of you who wrote in suggested, and it also just feels like a good way to start the week. If you want to be made aware of when we do drop that next episode, or whenever we're dropping brand new content, you can find all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliotOz. Oz is in Australia. This show is completely funded by our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I want to thank Alex H., Paul Delan, David Cohen, Thagor, Vincent, Axeloff, and John Kirkman, who are the latest patrons to sign up as of the time of recording. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, and we cannot thank them enough for their support. So if you feel you can spare a couple of dollars, and you want special access to content like our recent workshop unpacking the Taiwan invasion plans, or our upcoming analysis of Russia's modern invasion plans for Europe, simply sign up to Patreon today by following the links in the description. But for now, this episode on the small arms trade is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Running Guns, The Global Black Market in Small Arms by Laura Lumpe, for a deeper look at the inner workings of the global arms market. The second is How to Stage a Coup by Rory Cormack, for an idea on just how important small arms are and how they're utilized within rebel movements. And the third is What Makes a Terrorist? Economics and the Root of Terrorism by Alan B. Kruger, for a look at the underlying factors impacting and driving these groups and what actually keeps them sustained. I also want to give a thanks to this week's guests, Nick Marsh, Franz J. Marty, and Mark Bromley. All of you were absolutely fantastic on this one. And in addition to those guys, I would also like to give a thanks to the primary researchers for this piece, them being Ben Nutter, Robbie Sutton, Kashyap Maheshwari, and Jonah Gunn. On top of all that, I also have to give a massive thanks to the staff here at the program, that being Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Schenkman, the production manager, Daniela Juvella, Nate Ostilla, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Ben-Treith, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Donlan-May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Laurans Van Kielbilk, Mason Wise, Isaac Gibbs, Andrew Garbery, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Sean Cotterlem, our research assistants and writers. Jamie Tano, our media director, Raul Demanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Woolgarten from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Haimakainen, our Discord moderator, Drew Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. There is absolutely no way we could ever pull this show together without this amazing team. And lastly, I'm thrilled to say that the Red Line will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.